What if the biggest theft in banking history wasn't a crime at all? Imagine a mafia boss who walked into some of the most secure financial institutions in the world and walked away with $27 million. Not by hacking, robbing, or forging documents, but by exploiting the system without ever breaking a single law. This isn't fiction or a Hollywood script. It's a chilling reality that exposes the blind spots in our most trusted financial safeguards. Over months, this man orchestrated a complex operation, moving money across multiple banks, each transaction perfectly legal, yet collectively draining millions. When the banks finally noticed, it was too late. There were no grounds for prosecution, no crimes to charge, and no laws broken. The man vanished without a trace, leaving behind a financial puzzle and stunned authorities who had no tools to bring him to justice. The scale of this operation is staggering. $27 million, siphoned away under the noses of compliance officers, fraud detection algorithms, and regulatory watchdogs. It wasn't a quick heist or a reckless gamble. It was a meticulously planned strategy that took advantage of gaps in banking regulations and procedural loopholes. This wasn't about violence or intimidation. It was about deep knowledge, patience, and exploiting the rigid frameworks designed to protect assets. The banks, institutions built to safeguard money, found themselves powerless against a tactic that was perfectly legal yet devastatingly effective. In the end, they were left holding the bag, unable to reverse the losses or hold anyone accountable. This story challenges everything we think we know about financial crime. Usually, when millions disappear, there is an identifiable breach: fraudulent documents, stolen identities, or hacked systems. Here, none of those applied. The man behind the operation mastered the art of working within the rules, bending them to his advantage without ever crossing the line. His disappearance only deepened the mystery. Once the flow of funds stopped, all digital footprints evaporated. No transactions, no communications, no activity, just silence. Authorities were left with no jurisdiction, no evidence of wrongdoing, and no way to proceed. As Shadow Crimes unpacks this extraordinary case, it reveals not just how the operation unfolded, but why the banking system was unable to respond effectively. This is a story of a criminal who didn't need to break the law to win. Instead, he used the law as his weapon, outsmarting the very institutions designed to prevent theft. What happened next is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that legality does not always equate to justice, and sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who never step outside the lines. If you follow investigations into the unseen mechanisms that shape power and corruption, those that rarely surface in mainstream reports, this channel aims to provide a steady, uncompromising look beneath the surface. Here, we explore how legal frameworks can be manipulated, how loopholes become tools for exploitation, and how organized crime often operates in the shadows of legality. Subscribing ensures access to in-depth examinations of these complex realities, where facts matter more than spectacle, and where understanding the subtle interplay between law and crime is crucial. With that in place, we return to the story, a narrative not of blatant criminality but of a carefully orchestrated game, one where winning means bending the rules without breaking them. This is a world where the line between right and wrong blurs, and where the most effective offenses are those hidden behind the veneer of legality. The subject of our investigation exploited these ambiguities with precision, revealing vulnerabilities in systems thought to be safeguards. As we proceed, it becomes clear that this is not merely an isolated case but a reflection of wider patterns. The tactics used are replicated across sectors, quietly eroding the foundations of accountability. Understanding this requires patience and attention, as the truth is often obscured by complexity and deliberate obfuscation. The following chapters will unfold the layers of this calculated scheme, examining the structural weaknesses it exploited and the consequences that ripple far beyond the individual actor. It's a reminder that legality is not always synonymous with fairness, and that sometimes the most insidious crimes are those conducted within the letter of the law. Continuing this investigation means confronting uncomfortable truths about systems designed to protect us but vulnerable to manipulation. Before the banking operation commenced, the mafia boss occupied a position that was as much about management and control as it was about influence and authority. He was not the typical figurehead known primarily for brutal enforcement or impulsive acts of violence. Instead, his role within the organization was defined by a strategic mind, a clear understanding of hierarchy, and a disciplined approach to maintaining order within the complex web of organized crime. His reputation was built on his ability to orchestrate operations with precision, ensuring that each segment of the organization functioned like a well-oiled machine, minimizing exposure while maximizing profit. In the realm of organized crime, hierarchy is paramount, and this boss exemplified a keen respect for structure. Far from being a solitary figure issuing arbitrary commands, he operated within a clearly delineated chain of command. He delegated responsibilities carefully, empowering lieutenants and captains to oversee various sectors while maintaining ultimate oversight. This approach not only reinforced discipline but also created layers of insulation that shielded him from direct involvement in day-to-day illicit activities. Such a system required trust, rigorous enforcement of rules, and a shared understanding that loyalty was non-negotiable. His influence extended through these layers, ensuring cohesion and a unified strategy that advanced the organization's interests without unnecessary risk. Discipline under his leadership was not limited to obedience, but included a strict adherence to protocols that governed communication, financial transactions, and operational security. He recognized that impulsive decisions or unchecked aggression often attracted unwanted law enforcement attention, which could jeopardize the entire enterprise. Instead, he emphasized calculated moves, where patience and timing were critical. This methodical mindset fostered an environment where long-term gains were prioritized over short-term victories, a perspective that marked a departure from the often reckless narratives associated with Mafia leadership. Strategic thinking was perhaps his most distinguishing trait. He understood that the evolving landscape of law enforcement and financial regulation demanded adaptability. Instead of relying solely on traditional criminal enterprises, he saw the potential in exploiting legitimate systems to launder money and generate revenue. This foresight required a sophisticated grasp of legal frameworks, financial instruments, and risk management. His background before ascending to the leadership role involved exposure to environments where systemic operations and regulatory compliance were paramount. Whether through legitimate business ventures or indirect involvement in financial dealings, he had cultivated an understanding of how lawful systems could be manipulated without crossing overt legal lines. This nuanced comprehension of legality and risk positioned him uniquely within the Mafia world. While many peers viewed the law chiefly as an adversary to be circumvented through force or bribery, he recognized it as a system to be studied and, where possible, integrated into the organization's operations. This mindset allowed him to orchestrate activities that operated within gray areas, minimizing legal exposure while extracting maximum advantage. His ability to anticipate regulatory loopholes and exploit them strategically was a skill set rarely seen in traditional Mafia hierarchies, where muscle and intimidation often overshadowed intellectual capital. Moreover, his influence was reinforced by a reputation for measured judgment and a calm demeanor. Associates and rivals alike acknowledged his capacity to weigh complex scenarios and make decisions grounded in careful analysis rather than emotion. This steadiness fostered loyalty and respect, underpinning an organizational culture that valued control and foresight over chaos and impulsiveness. His leadership style, therefore, was less about spectacle and more about sustainable dominance, achieved through meticulous planning and adherence to an internal code that balanced ambition with caution. In sum, before the banking operation began, this Mafia boss was a figure defined by his sophisticated understanding of organizational structures, strategic discipline, and legal nuance. His unique background enabled him to navigate the intricate interplay between illicit ambitions and legitimate frameworks, setting the stage for a criminal enterprise that blurred the lines between legality and deception with unprecedented precision. This foundation was crucial in orchestrating the banking scheme that would follow, revealing how a deep comprehension of systems and risk could transform traditional organized crime into a shadow operation operating in plain sight. Banks were targeted because their systems, by design, rely heavily on standardized procedures and institutional trust rather than continuous suspicion of individual transactions. Unlike casinos, businesses, or individuals, banks operate within a rigid framework governed by regulatory compliance, audits, and automated safeguards that prioritize process adherence over anomaly detection. This structural emphasis inadvertently creates blind spots that can be exploited by someone adept at navigating the fine print of system design and regulatory expectations. At the core of banking operations lies a complex network of compliance mechanisms intended to prevent fraud and money laundering. These include Know Your Customer, KYC, protocols, anti-money laundering, AML, regulations, and periodic financial audits. Each component functions as a checkpoint, but their effectiveness is predicated on procedural conformity rather than active suspicion. For example, compliance officers verify that customer documentation meets legal standards, but they rarely investigate beyond the surface unless clear red flags arise. This reliance on documentation and formal approvals opens a window for manipulation when one understands the exact parameters that trigger scrutiny and how to stay just beneath those thresholds. Audits, both internal and external, serve as additional layers of oversight. However, audits focus primarily on verifying that transactions and records align with established policies and accounting principles. They are not designed to detect cleverly disguised illicit activities hidden within legitimate operations. Automated auditing tools scan for irregularities based on preset algorithms, which depend on historical data and known risk factors. A well-crafted scheme that mimics normal banking behavior can easily evade these algorithms, as it does not raise statistical anomalies or breach procedural norms. Automated safeguards, such as transaction monitoring systems, rely on pattern recognition to flag suspicious activity. These systems excel at identifying obvious outliers, large, sudden transfers, or unusual account activities, but struggle with subtle, incremental manipulations that stay within expected behavioral patterns. The bank's priority is to maintain operational efficiency and customer service by minimizing false positives. Thus, these automated systems are calibrated to avoid excessive disruption. This balance between vigilance and practicality unintentionally permits gradual exploitation, especially when transactions are spread across multiple accounts and jurisdictions to mask their true nature. Legal constraints further shape banking operations by establishing strict boundaries around data privacy, customer rights, and due process. Banks cannot arbitrarily block or investigate accounts without sufficient cause, as doing so would risk legal repercussions and damage to their reputation. This creates a procedural barrier where suspicion must be justified through documented evidence before action is taken. Consequently, banks operate under a principle of innocent until proven guilty in financial terms, which benefits those who can engineer transactions that appear legitimate on paper. In contrast, casinos and businesses often have more immediate, discretionary control over their operations and clientele. Casinos might monitor behavior in real time and intervene based on observed patterns, while businesses can react swiftly to irregularities affecting their bottom line. Individuals, by nature, lack the scale and systemic integration that banks possess, making large-scale exploitation difficult. Banks' reliance on formalized processes and layered compliance creates an environment where deception can be embedded within the system itself, rather than relying on external breaches or overt criminal acts. This reliance on procedure over suspicion is precisely what made banks the perfect target for shadow crimes. The scheme capitalized on the predictable rhythms of banking compliance and auditing, weaving illicit activity into routine transactions that pass through the system unnoticed. By understanding the interplay between regulatory frameworks and institutional behavior, the operation exploited the inherent tension banks face between facilitating legitimate financial flows and guarding against abuse. The resulting blind spots were not flaws but features of a system designed to prioritize order and trust, inadvertently enabling those with insider knowledge to operate in the shadows with unprecedented precision. The operation was made possible by a legal framework that, while robust in many respects, contained specific provisions and structures that inadvertently allowed certain activities to proceed unchecked. At its core, the system was built to balance two primary objectives: enabling smooth financial transactions and protecting the integrity of the market. This balance was maintained through a set of rules that emphasized transparency and accountability, but these rules also created predictable processes and timelines that those familiar with the system could anticipate and navigate strategically. One crucial element was the regulatory requirement that banks and financial institutions follow prescribed procedures when handling transactions. These procedures included mandatory waiting periods and verification steps designed to prevent fraud and money laundering. However, these safeguards operated under strict legal timelines and conditions that limited the discretion of banking officials. Once a transaction met the formal criteria for legitimacy, banks were obliged to proceed without delay. This meant that if all documentation appeared in order, banks could not unilaterally halt or reverse transactions based on suspicion alone, unless there was concrete evidence of wrongdoing presented within the regulatory framework. Furthermore, the legal protections granted to clients under financial privacy laws imposed additional constraints on banks. These laws restricted the sharing of client information without proper authorization or legal cause. As a result, banks could not proactively disclose or investigate suspicious activity beyond what the law explicitly allowed. This created a protective barrier around the transaction process, ensuring that legitimate customer rights were preserved even when certain patterns suggested potential abuse. Another factor was the segmentation of responsibilities among regulatory bodies and financial institutions. Different agencies oversaw compliance, risk management, and fraud detection, each with clearly defined roles and limited overlap. This compartmentalization led to situations where no single entity had a comprehensive view of the unfolding operation. Banks relied on their internal compliance teams to flag irregularities, but these teams operated within strict guidelines that prioritized documented evidence over intuition or informal concerns. Without explicit legal mandates to intervene preemptively, banks were effectively restrained from disrupting transactions based on suspicion or incomplete information. The operation also exploited timing rules embedded in the legal structure. Certain financial processes required a series of sequential steps, such as confirmation windows, settlement periods, and reporting deadlines that were rigidly enforced. These sequences created predictable windows during which transactions could be initiated, processed, and finalized without interruption. Banks had no legal authority to extend these deadlines or impose extra scrutiny once the process had commenced and met the regulatory standards. This rigidity ensured stability and predictability for the market but simultaneously provided a framework within which calculated maneuvers could unfold smoothly. Additionally, the legal framework placed a strong emphasis on formal documentation and procedural compliance. Any action taken by banks to block or investigate a transaction had to be supported by concrete evidence documented through defined channels. Mere suspicion or patterns not explicitly covered by existing regulations were insufficient grounds for intervention. This reliance on documented facts over discretionary judgment created a procedural shield that protected the operation from early detection or interference. In sum, the legal framework was designed to uphold order, trust, and fairness in financial markets by enforcing clear rules, respecting client rights, and limiting discretionary power. These features, while essential for legitimate commerce, inadvertently created an environment where a well-informed actor could execute a complex operation within legal boundaries. The system's checks and balances did not fail because of negligence, but because they functioned exactly as intended, prioritizing formal compliance and protecting individual rights over speculative intervention. This allowed the operation to proceed with precision, remaining fully lawful while exploiting the inherent limitations and procedural safeguards of the financial regulatory structure. The flow of funds was meticulously orchestrated to blend seamlessly within the normal operational patterns of the financial institutions involved. Rather than executing large, conspicuous transfers that could easily trigger automated alerts or manual reviews, the operation favored incremental movements dispersed across time and channels. By dividing significant sums into smaller, seemingly routine transactions, the process maintained volumes comfortably below the established thresholds that typically activate system flags. This fragmentation was not random but carefully calibrated to align with historical transaction data, ensuring that the activity fell well within expected behavioral ranges for each account. Timing played a crucial role in evading detection. Transfers were scheduled during periods of standard business activity, avoiding unusual hours or spikes that might raise suspicion. The operators leveraged patterns consistent with payroll distributions, vendor payments, and other legitimate financial routines. This adherence to predictable temporal windows created a rhythm that the monitoring systems recognized as normal, reducing the likelihood of triggering rule-based exceptions. Additionally, the The slight variations introduced in timing, deliberate but subtle, helped mimic the natural irregularities of genuine account activity, a factor that further masked the underlying intent. Repetition of transactions followed well-established cycles familiar to the institution's oversight frameworks. Monthly, bi-weekly, or quarterly intervals mirrored typical organizational cash flow schedules, reinforcing the perception of legitimacy. This repetitive structure also exploited the human element in the compliance process. Seasoned analysts often rely on pattern recognition and context to prioritize cases. The predictability of these transactions contributed to their classification as low risk, as they matched profiles of routine operational behavior rather than anomalous or erratic conduct. Layering was achieved not only through the segmentation of amounts and timing, but also by routing funds through a network of interrelated accounts with diverse ownership and operational purposes. Each step in the chain was designed to appear as an independent, justifiable transaction, such as payments for consulting services, rental agreements, or interdepartmental transfers. This multiplicity of justifications, supported by appropriate documentation and consistent with the documented business activities of the entities involved, reinforced the facade of authenticity. The system's algorithms, which are attuned to parsing transactional metadata and contextual relationships, interpreted these flows as coherent and compliant, thereby bypassing deeper scrutiny. Moreover, the repositioning of funds was occasionally synchronized with legitimate financial events, such as contract renewals or fiscal year-end adjustments. This synchronization provided plausible explanations for changes in fund distribution, aligning with external documentation and audit trails. By embedding the illicit transfers within verifiable operational milestones, the scheme further reduced the risk of inconsistency detection. The financial oversight tools, designed to prioritize anomalies that deviate from known operational baselines, thus categorized these movements as routine fluctuations rather than suspicious activity. The overall approach capitalized on the system's inherent design to weigh transaction legitimacy heavily on formal compliance metrics rather than speculative risk assessments. The rigorous adherence to documentation standards and procedural formalities, such as proper invoicing, authorized signatories, and compliance with declared business purposes, meant that the activity satisfied the system's criteria for lawful conduct. As a result, the automated controls and human reviews alike found no procedural grounds to escalate or block the transfers. In essence, the operation's success in moving money without raising alarms rested on a sophisticated understanding of both technological and procedural safeguards. By controlling the volume and timing of transactions, leveraging predictable repetition, and embedding transfers within legitimate operational frameworks, the actors navigated the system's defenses with precision. This systemic exploitation illustrates how compliance-driven financial infrastructures, while robust in preventing overt misconduct, can be methodically circumvented through disciplined, lawful-appearing activity that exploits the very parameters established to balance oversight and individual rights. Within the banking institutions, the earliest hints that something amiss was unfolding were subtle and easily overshadowed by routine operations. Analysts and mid-level managers noticed irregularities, small discrepancies in transactional data, uncharacteristic patterns in loan repayments, and occasional spikes in customer complaints. Yet, these signs were often filtered through layers of procedural review that naturally sought to contextualize and rationalize such anomalies. Losses flagged in internal audits were initially interpreted as isolated incidents, attributed to market fluctuations or clerical errors rather than systemic failure. These early losses were, more often than not, misclassified or delayed in reporting. Departments responsible for risk assessment and compliance followed established protocols that prioritized confirmation before escalation. When a loss surfaced, it was typically categorized under broader financial adjustments or absorbed into general provisioning, effectively diluting its perceived significance. This approach, while standard practice, created a buffer that postponed meaningful intervention. The institutional mindset leaned towards caution, wary of raising alarms without incontrovertible evidence. In this environment, hesitation was less a sign of negligence and more a reflection of ingrained risk management culture that valued measured responses over premature conclusions. Compounding this inertia was the complexity of the transactions involved. Many irregular activities were embedded within legitimate operations, cloaked by layers of lawful documentation and seemingly standard financial instruments. The sophistication of these maneuvers meant that initial red flags were often interpreted as anomalies in data processing or exceptions attributable to new product lines or market trends. This interpretive flexibility allowed the issues to remain under the radar, as teams sought corroboration across departments before acknowledging the possibility of systemic problems. Even when internal committees convened to discuss emerging concerns, the conversation was marked by careful deliberation rather than urgency. Analysts presented findings with caveats, emphasizing the need for further investigation and data verification. Senior managers expressed reservations about prematurely classifying these events as indicators of larger risk, mindful of the reputational and financial implications for the institution. This cautious stance resulted in a gradual escalation of awareness rather than a swift mobilization of resources. The culture favored stability and continuity, making it difficult for disruptive revelations to gain immediate traction. This procedural delay was not indicative of willful blindness, but rather the natural outcome of entrenched institutional norms designed to prevent overreaction. In such complex ecosystems, the balance between vigilance and operational continuity is delicate. Early warnings were met with skepticism, not because of denial, but due to a systemic preference for evidence-based action. The internal dialogue reflected a tension between acknowledging potential vulnerabilities and maintaining confidence in established controls. As these internal dynamics played out, the slow accumulation of unresolved discrepancies began to form a pattern too persistent to ignore. Yet, it was only through persistent inquiry and cross-departmental collaboration that the true scale of the issue started to emerge. The process was gradual, marked by incremental acknowledgement rather than sudden revelation. If you're intrigued by how these invisible cracks within financial institutions unfold and want to explore more real investigations into hidden crimes and the legal gray areas that shadow crimes exposes, consider subscribing. It's a chance to stay informed about the subtle, often overlooked mechanisms that shape our financial and legal landscapes. As compliance teams and investigators delve deeper into the intricacies of the alleged irregularities, a gradual but unmistakable shift in perspective began to take shape. Their initial approach had been rigorous, driven by a firm presumption that legal breaches were present within the bank's operational framework. However, as the layers of transactions, communications, and internal processes were meticulously dissected, the expected patterns of illegality failed to materialize. The documents, while indicating questionable practices in a superficial sense, consistently aligned with existing regulatory frameworks and internal policies. This realization was not instantaneous. Rather, it emerged through a series of methodical verifications and cross-references against applicable laws and compliance standards. The internal investigative units encountered numerous procedural dead ends. Each potential violation initially flagged was subjected to stringent legal scrutiny, often involving external legal counsel and regulatory advisors. These reviews consistently concluded that the actions in question, although ethically ambiguous and operationally risky, did not contravene statutory provisions or regulatory mandates. This outcome was particularly evident in areas where the bank's internal controls had been designed to operate within broad discretionary boundaries, leaving significant room for interpretive flexibility. The investigators' reports documented these findings with precision, noting the absence of concrete legal infractions despite the presence of operational anomalies. Institutionally, this impasse exposed inherent limitations within the bank's oversight mechanisms. Compliance frameworks, while robust in detecting formal breaches, proved less effective in addressing activities that, though potentially harmful in a reputational or systemic sense, remained legally permissible under current legislation. The investigative process highlighted a structural gap. The regulatory architecture was not sufficiently adaptive to emerging financial practices that skirted the edges of legality without crossing definitive lines. This lacuna underscored a fundamental challenge faced by compliance teams, distinguishing between unethical conduct and illegal behavior within the confines of extant legal definitions. Efforts to escalate concerns to senior management and external regulators encountered similar obstacles. Senior executives, informed by the comprehensive investigative reports, recognized that pursuing formal charges or seeking recovery actions would lack a substantive legal foundation. Escalations intended to prompt regulatory intervention were met with cautious responses, as regulators themselves acknowledged the absence of clear statutory violations. This mutual acknowledgement between the bank and regulatory bodies effectively curtailed momentum for punitive measures, relegating the situation to a domain of heightened vigilance rather than active prosecution or remediation. The procedural limitations extended beyond legal interpretation into practical enforcement. Without definitive evidence of wrongdoing, the institution's options were constrained to reinforcing internal controls, revising operational guidelines, and enhancing monitoring protocols. These steps, while necessary, fell short of the decisive corrective actions typically associated with confirmed legal breaches. The investigative teams documented the necessity of these measures but emphasized their reactive and preventive nature rather than remedial efficacy. This phase of realization marked a critical juncture in the institution's approach to governance and risk management. The absence of legal grounds for charges did not equate to institutional complacency. Instead, it prompted a reevaluation of compliance strategies and a recognition of the need for evolving regulatory frameworks. The bank acknowledged that its existing policies and the surrounding legal environment were insufficient to address the nuanced realities of shadow crimes, those opaque, often borderline activities that challenge conventional definitions of financial misconduct. In conclusion, the moment when investigators and compliance personnel recognized the lack of legal basis for charges or recovery was characterized by methodical analysis, procedural rigor, and an unambiguous confrontation with institutional constraints. The process illuminated the boundaries of legal accountability within the banking sector, revealing how certain activities, while problematic in operational and ethical terms, remain shielded by the very frameworks designed to regulate them. This acknowledgement shaped subsequent institutional responses, emphasizing adaptation and vigilance over punitive actions, and underscored the complexities inherent in policing the subtle, often invisible cracks within modern financial systems. In the weeks following the final court proceedings, a meticulous silence enveloped the Mafia boss's digital and financial presence, marking the onset of a calculated and deliberate disappearance. The first clear indication occurred when all known financial activity linked to him abruptly ceased without explanation. Bank accounts, which had previously exhibited consistent inflows and outflows tied to both legitimate enterprises and shadow operations, showed no transactions beyond a specific cutoff date. This cessation was abrupt and total, suggesting a premeditated move rather than a reactionary one. Financial institutions, despite their routine monitoring, found no anomalies or attempts to access these funds afterward, reinforcing the conclusion that this halt was orchestrated by the individual himself. Simultaneously, his physical presence began to evaporate from all recognized locations. Known residences associated with him were vacated in a manner that left no trace of a hurried departure. Personal belongings were removed systematically, properties were sold or quietly transferred to proxies, and no attempts were made to maintain or manage these assets directly. Surveillance and law enforcement logs confirmed the absence of any verified sightings or movements from his usual circles. Additionally, visits to customary meeting points, whether social, business-related, or informal, ceased entirely, further underlining a purposeful retreat from all familiar environments. In the digital realm, his footprint diminished to non-existence. Prior to the disappearance, his communications had been limited and carefully controlled, yet still traceable through encrypted channels and monitored networks. After the cutoff, no new messages, calls, or digital interactions could be attributed to him. Attempts to locate him through electronic means, such as tracking mobile devices, internet logins, or usage of encrypted messaging platforms, yielded no results. This absence extended to social media and professional networks, areas where even clandestine figures often maintain some presence. The total evaporation of digital traces effectively erased his existence from online databases and surveillance infrastructures. Notably, despite the high-profile nature of his prior activities and the public attention they garnered, there was an absence of any formal legal pursuit following his disappearance. No active warrants, ongoing investigations, or arrest attempts were recorded in connection with him after his withdrawal. Law enforcement agencies, while maintaining open files, showed no signs of escalating efforts or public alerts, This lack of pursuit suggests either a recognition of the futility of locating an individual who had carefully crafted his vanishing or an implicit acknowledgement of the limits of jurisdiction and enforcement in such cases. Collectively, these facts paint a picture of a disappearance executed with precision and foresight. The halt in financial transactions was not a sudden blackout but rather a controlled shutdown, designed to avoid triggering automatic flags or alarms within financial institutions. The methodical clearing out of physical properties and detachment from known spheres indicate thorough planning, likely involving trusted intermediaries to handle asset divestment and ensure no loose ends remained. The complete erasure from digital records points to advanced operational security measures, including the abandonment or destruction of personal devices and the cessation of all identifiable electronic communications. This disappearance contrasts sharply with chaotic or forced absences often seen in similar contexts. Instead, it exemplifies a clean, calculated exit strategy, one that minimizes exposure and maximizes anonymity. The absence of legal pursuit reinforces the notion that the disappearance was not only well executed but also effective in removing the subject from the radar of authorities and adversaries alike. Through these confirmed facts, the vanishing of the Mafia boss emerges as a deliberate, strategic withdrawal, underscored by meticulous preparation and an unwavering commitment to erasing every trace of existence within the intersecting realms of finance, physical presence, and digital connectivity. The inability of authorities to locate or charge him following his vanishing was the outcome of a calculated convergence of factors that systematically dismantled the usual mechanisms of law enforcement. Jurisdictional barriers played a pivotal role, as his disappearance spanned multiple countries and continents, exploiting the fragmented nature of international legal systems. Each nation operates under distinct legal frameworks, with varying degrees of cooperation in extradition and investigation. This patchwork of sovereignty created a labyrinthine environment that hindered any unified pursuit. Requests for information or assistance frequently stalled at bureaucratic checkpoints, with some states unwilling or unable to commit resources to a case complicated by political sensitivities and diplomatic caution. Legal exposure limits further compounded the challenge. His activities, while undoubtedly illicit, were often shrouded behind layers of intermediaries and complex corporate veils, effectively insulating him from direct culpability. The evidence that authorities could assemble was largely circumstantial or hinged on testimonies from unreliable witnesses, many of whom disappeared or recanted under pressure. Prosecutors faced an uphill battle, as statutes of limitations loomed, and the burden of proof required to initiate charges was insurmountable without concrete leads. The absence of physical custody denied investigators the opportunity to compel testimony or conduct searches, leaving them reliant on fragmented intelligence that was insufficient to meet the threshold for formal indictment. Identity insulation was perhaps the most significant factor in his sustained invisibility. From the outset, he had engineered an existence that was deliberately ephemeral. Multiple aliases, forged documents, and a network of trusted operatives ensured that any attempt to pinpoint his location was met with dead ends. His digital footprint was almost non-existent, a ghost in the modern surveillance apparatus. He avoided traceable communication devices and utilized encrypted channels that were either impenetrable or led to dead drop points far removed from his actual whereabouts. Financial transactions were routed through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts, each layer designed to obfuscate the money trail. This careful compartmentalization of identity and resources rendered traditional investigative tools ineffective. Procedural paralysis emerged as a natural consequence of these obstacles. Law enforcement agencies found themselves caught in a cycle of reactive measures, perpetually chasing shadows rather than concrete leads. Interagency cooperation, although initiated, was often slow and fraught with jurisdictional disputes, undermining swift action. The reliance on international treaties and mutual legal assistance agreements introduced delays and legal complexities that sapped momentum. In some cases, political considerations and corruption within certain jurisdictions further stalled progress, as local authorities either lacked the will or the power to pursue the investigation aggressively. The resulting inertia created an environment in which no decisive steps could be taken to break the stalemate. Ultimately, the system was left without remaining tools to act because every conventional avenue had been preemptively neutralized by his foresight. The absence of a physical presence eliminated opportunities for arrest or surveillance. The lack of admissible evidence precluded charges. The fractured international legal landscape prevented coordinated action. His self-imposed invisibility through identity insulation thwarted tracking efforts. And the procedural gridlock ensured that time, rather than justice, became the prevailing force. In this carefully orchestrated vacuum, the authorities' reach was rendered ineffective, leaving the enigmatic figure beyond the grasp of the law and reinforcing the notion that his disappearance was not merely an escape but a masterstroke of strategic erasure. The fallout from this case has exposed cracks far deeper than any single investigation could reveal. The very systems designed to safeguard global finance and uphold justice proved shockingly fragile when confronted with a figure who operated not by blatant lawbreaking but by exploiting the yawning gaps in regulation and oversight. This was not a story of outright criminality easily caught by the law's net. It was a demonstration of how procedural inertia and legal blind spots can be weaponized to dismantle accountability from within. While billions moved through the shadows, the mechanisms intended to track and contain such flows faltered, ensnared by jurisdictional disputes, outdated protocols, and an unsettling lack of coordination among international agencies. What stands out is the meticulous construction of invisibility, a labyrinth of false identities, shell corporations, and deliberately opaque transactions that rendered conventional investigative tools impotent. Each layer peeled back revealed another veil of complexity, an intricate design far beyond the simple tactics of fraud or theft. The absence of a smoking gun was not due to lack of evidence but the calculated absence of direct illegality, a stark demonstration of how exploiting systemic weaknesses can be just as effective as breaking the law outright. In this liminal space between legality and wrongdoing, the law's reach was not just limited, it was effectively neutralized. The procedural gridlock that ensued was no accident. It was a byproduct of legal frameworks straining under the weight of transnational finance and digital anonymity, revealing an uncomfortable truth. Current systems are ill-equipped to handle crimes that do not fit neatly into predefined categories. The delays, jurisdictional stalemates, and bureaucratic paralysis allowed time to erode the effectiveness of every effort to bring clarity or consequence. Justice became a moving target, slipping further away as the case dissolved into a tangle of unresolvable questions. This chilling reality undermines confidence in a global system that assumes transparency and enforceability but, in practice, can be systematically circumvented. The disappearance of the central figure was not an act of desperation but the final maneuver in a meticulously planned operation of erasure. It was a demonstration not just of personal evasion but of systemic vulnerability, how a single individual leveraging the gaps in law and finance can become untouchable. This is not a story of failure by chance but by design. It underscores a stark and unsettling fact. The combination of sophisticated legal insulation and fragmented regulatory oversight can allow entire networks of influence and wealth to operate beyond scrutiny and consequence. If this case teaches anything, it is that the invisible crimes, the ones that dissolve before the law can catch them, are not anomalies but symptoms of a system that has fallen behind the ingenuity of those it seeks to regulate. The legal blind spots revealed here are not theoretical. They are active loopholes exploited daily by actors who understand how to navigate the shadows without ever breaking explicit rules. The consequences ripple far beyond a single investigation, challenging the very foundations of accountability in global finance. For those who want to delve deeper into stories where the line between legality and criminality blurs, where invisible crimes unfold in the gaps of law, and where individuals outmaneuver entire systems without crossing the threshold of illegality, subscribe, like, and join the conversation below. Your engagement fuels the exploration of these shadowy realms, illuminating the cracks and corners where truth often hides.